I usually enjoy this part of conferences the most. I love being able to ask questions and get to interact with our speakers. And so let me just briefly give an introduction as to how this is going to go. We have about 45 minutes, and I've developed a whole list of questions for our panel discussions. I've not been a very good panel discussion leader because I've not let them see the questions. I think generally as a rule of thumb you should let them see the questions first. I've not done that. But as interesting as I may think my questions are, I'm sure that everybody here would like a chance to ask questions. And so I'm just going to lead off with one to kind of get the ball rolling. And then if you have a question, for the sake of recording, wait and I'll run down. I'll get some good exercise running around and let you ask the question in the microphone. And if nobody has any questions or if nothing comes to mind, then I'll just kind of continue down my list of what I think are going to be amazing questions. But let's begin. In the 1950s and 1960s, some therapists employed aversion therapy of the kind featured in A Clockwork Orange, the film, to cure homosexuality. This typically involved showing patients pictures of men while giving them electric shocks or drugs to make them vomit. And once they could no longer bear it, they'd show pictures of naked women or send them on a date with a young nurse. Needless to say, these cruel and degrading methods proved entirely ineffective. Fast forward to 1987, when the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, removed homosexuality for the first time from the DSM, the main psychological manual. And it was not until 1987 that homosexuality actually fell out of the manual for how to treat what was then perceived as a psychological disorder. Fast forward a couple more decades. Today, not only is homosexuality seen as not a sin by our culture, nor a mental disorder, but something to be celebrated and zealously protected. My question then, and if it's okay, Dr. Yuan, if I can start with you, is how should we as followers of Christ understand this powerful cultural revolution that has taken place? And while he's thinking about that, your questions here in a minute don't have to follow mine. They can be of another nature, but I just kind of wanted to get your opinions about how this has taken place and how we should understand the revolution that's happened very, very quickly, even in my lifetime.
That was a great lead-in, Daniel. Good summary. So I think there's several things that I want to say. Yes, it is true about the aversion therapy. Oftentimes, and I think we need to recognize that and also we need to recognize that that wasn't necessarily what was just done by Christians. This was something that was done by lots of people, secular and Christian. The weapon that is often used today is reparative therapy is wrong because it's aversion therapy. That's not that's not correct. You may have heard I'm not an advocate for reparative therapy, but I also do not think right now the way it's being attacked is correct. I'm familiar with it. It is not, I don't know anyone who does aversion therapy anymore, because that's usually, they say reparative therapy is wrong because they do electric shock therapy. I don't know anyone who does electric shock therapy. Reparative therapy is essentially, it's developmental theory where it's going, looking to your past and saying, did you have a bad relationship with your father, mother, et cetera, and so how can we work through those kind of father wounds or et cetera, and that will help you to resolve your unwanted same-sex attractions. And so anyway, that's kind of reparative therapy model. And my next talk will be addressing that, the etiology and concept with looking at biblical theology and the gospel and sin and Christ and how that is resolved. But with all that said, even though I find that the answer is being the church and the gospel and discipleship as the answer, true discipleship, not just like a support group as discipleship, but true discipleship, with a pastor or a spiritual leader, I will fight those who are trying to make it illegal. Because that's difficult. People really are confused because they would expect me then to try to help them to make it illegal. And if you've been following, many states have already made reparative therapy illegal for minors, and I think that is absolutely wrong. And I'm not defending that from a Christian perspective. I'm defending that just simply from a constitutional perspective. Politicians should have no business telling professionals what to do. What do politicians know? Thank you. And they're telling a doctor what to do? Please. So that, you know, I mean, politicians should not be telling a doctor what to do. That's ridiculous. Unfortunately, insurances are doing that, but that's a whole nother story. And that's why, you know, with government insurance, anyway, that's a whole nother story. But that's really dangerous when the government begins telling and dictating professionals what to do. So it's, but there's a lot of culture around this. There's a lot of movies coming out, and the latest one, I can't remember, it has Spartacus in it. What's that guy's? Not Spartacus. What's the Australian guy? Yeah, Russell Crowe. And what's the name of that movie? Russell Crowe, and then the other Australian lady with the blonde, red hair. I'm so bad. But anyway, and then the other young guy who's the son. So they play the pastor, the pastor's wife, and the son, and they're talking about how they're rejecting the son. And I'm sure it's going to be a very artistically emotional movie, and the story will be well written and etc. But it's just a bad portrayal of Christians. And anyway, so that's Christians were being portrayed in that way. I think we need to be just careful in the way that we articulate what is the issue with homosexuality, that the issue is sin, and guess what? That's all of our issues. So we're not picking and choosing that this is sin or this issue is different from ours, anyone. But because the issue is sin, we're pointing it right back to the gospel. I guess my answer for everything is just to make sure that it's really Bible grounded and pointing to the gospel, and Christ is the answer.
Ken, can I, as I move out here to the audience, actually I will physically do that. How, over the course of your life, as you've watched our culture, American culture, shift from the 1950s and 60s, what Dr. Yuan was talking about there, the kinds of therapy, to now where it's celebrated, homosexuality, how have you as a believer, and how do you think that we as believers should interpret that change? How should we understand that major cultural shift and fast cultural shift?
This may sound simplistic, but I read it through Romans 1. I think it is the direct result of rebellion against God as a culture. They did not like to retain God in their knowledge, so he started them down the steps. And we're down there. I take it all back to a rejection of God. It's judgment, culturally.
Dr. Wheeler or Jonathan, if either of you have anything to chime in, please go ahead. I will say, just raise your hand if you do have a question, and I'll kind of silently make my way over to you as we get going.
Thank you. Just to kind of go along with that a little bit, I think that, you know, the sin of homosexuality isn't something that just has happened, you know, recently in the last 20 years. This is something that you've seen in past cultures and past cities, and because of that, I don't think that all of a sudden, you know, we have this generation who all of a sudden is just more gay because of, you know, right now that this sin has been in really our DNA, because what Christopher has said is all of us are born sinners. And so it's not like this is something new or something that should be surprising to us at all. Something that I guess doesn't upset me, but we have lots of Christian leaders who are just up in arms about all the laws being passed in favor for homosexuality, when honestly, this world is broken. and we should never be surprised that the world is acting like the world. And so I just think that there are other issues that we have to address beforehand. We should never be focusing so much on the behavior as the heart. And so, yeah, I just don't think this is something that's brand new, and we should never be surprised as a church.
Thanks, Jonathan. All right, I've got a question back here.
Dr. Yuan, in your first session, you made a comment about unconditional love does not equal unconditional approval. And I'm wondering, as a believer who meets someone for the first time coming into the church or into my community, relatively easy for me to accept them without judging them. But when it gets close to home, a family member or someone that I love and care for, how do I distinguish between love and approval in a practical way?
Sure. And my full statement is unconditional love is not the same as unconditional approval of my behavior or our behavior or just of behavior. So it's being clear what is approved, because there's a lot of different ways that people can define that, but specifically approval of my behavior or of behavior. So God loves us even though he doesn't approve of our sinful behavior. So when it's real in our own lives, I think a good example would be when you have a son or daughter who's in a relationship that is not honoring to God, whether it's a same-sex relationship or whether it is a daughter who's living with her boyfriend, whether it is, it could even be a son who says he's a follower of Christ and he's dating someone who is not a follower of Christ. So one example would be, I get a lot of parents that say, should I invite my gay son's partner over for Thanksgiving? So this would be an example of grace and truth. So we oftentimes falsely polarize or put this dichotomy between love and truth. I think that's wrong. You can't have love apart from truth. If you read 1 Corinthians 13, love rejoices in truth. So therefore, there is no love if there's no truth. So it's not that love and truth are somehow like polar opposites. I see that love is full of grace and full of truth. So a way to be full of grace and full of truth, an example, I would invite both of them to come home for Thanksgiving, my son and his partner. I just would not put them in the same bedroom to stay overnight. I would put them in separate bedrooms. So that would be an example. I think I was talking to a student who worked at, Outback or something, and they had a coworker who was gay. So how do we extend love and show grace, but we're not affirming? So if this coworker was just getting married, I think a good way is our words should not affirm. I cannot say, I'm so happy for you, congratulations. Those obviously are words of affirmation of the marriage. But I could say something like, I see you're really happy. That was a true statement, but it was just repeating or just restating the obvious, but at least it's reaffirming that person, but not affirming their relationship. I think it's okay to ask about, the date. When is the date? That's not a statement of affirmation. That's just a statement for information. But it's continuing the conversation and relationship and extending and deepening that relationship with that person. So those are examples where we can show unconditional love, but we're not approving of their behavior.
Anybody else want to add anything else to that? That was a great question. And I've got one here, Arlen.
Christopher, yesterday your mother referred to her children, and that piqued my curiosity. Do you have any brothers or sisters?
Well, I have lots of brothers and sisters.
In the flesh.
Do I have in the flesh? But I have one older blood brother. His name is Stephen, which is so ironic, right? Stephen and Christopher. My parents were not Christian when they named us, but God knew our names. They were graven in his hands. So we don't talk. We always get this question after people read our book and hear our story. God's still writing his story, so we kind of we want him to be able to tell that story when he's ready. Yeah. So God has his ways of keeping us on our knees. So pray for Stephen.
Thanks, Dr. Yuan. We've got a question down here.
This is for Christopher. I talked to your mother yesterday, and we were discussing there were some years when you were in prison that you would not return calls, or however that worked, no communication. When that communication began, you started the ball rolling. What kind of things did your mother, what was the discussion like between the time that you reached out to her and the time that you trusted Christ? And how did she walk that tightrope of acceptance and approval?
Great question. So, my parents were at the bottom of the list. They were, I had no one, I kind of had depleted all my friends, and no one was answering my phone call. They weren't coming to visit me, none of that. So I was like, it'd be nice to be able to talk to someone. And so I guess I'll just call home. I did not want to. Immediately, I told you how my mom responded. I was thinking she's going to yell at me, you deserve it, whatever, blah, blah, blah. And, I was imagining, how like Charlie Brown and the wah, 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 I was like, well, I'm just thinking in my mind. And her first words were, "Are you okay?" And immediately she bought a plane ticket to come visit me. I remember I had hundreds of friends that were just down the street. And my mother flew from Chicago, just immediately the next day. I don't even know. That must have cost her really a lot. The next day came to fly down to Atlanta to see me. She couldn't see me because it wasn't visitation day. There's only one day a week that we have visitations. So she arranged a friend of a friend of a friend who was a lawyer in Atlanta to be able to bring her in as a legal visitation, because legal visitation can be any day, right? So, that's a Tiger mom. She makes it happen. Praise the Lord for moms like that. But she did, and she was very intentional about what she was going to do that first day, because remember, there was tension. I hated her religion. I did not want anything. They were not my family. My friends were my family. As a matter of fact, it's so deceptive how Satan is of destroying the family, because gays and lesbians, we call each other, you know what? Family. Is he family? In other words, is he gay? Is she family? Is she gay? Our song was, "We are family." You guys know that song? I got all my sisters in me, the Sister Sledge. So, total campy, very gay song. But see how deceptive God is to destroy the family? And so she knew that she was fighting. She had a vision, and she had this picture in her mind that it was me in the middle, my parents on one side, and my gay family on the other, and they were winning. So they were a tug of war. So she was very intentional about, she brought all my kids' pictures, and I sat on one side of the glass, and she on the other, and she would put up these pictures, just to remind me. I don't think she really realized this, but she reminded me that we are family. She prayed about this, what to do, and she just thought, okay, maybe I'll bring these pictures. And so she would, and it was very emotional. And she prayed, she said, "God, don't make me cry, don't make me cry, don't make me cry." You know what I mean? And then at the end she said, she was going to say, I'm just going to ask, can we pray? Because every other instance, I was like, no, you ain't going to pray for me. And I just said yes. I mean, I just don't remember all this, so we put our hands on the glass, and we prayed through the phone, and she prayed. But all of our phone calls were just about, how are you doing? And they did not, like Pastor Ken, I mean, they did not bring up, are you still gay? What do you think about this? What do you think about this passage? Is it this sin? It needed time. But they prayed. They prayed specifically, what should we say? So it's not just do anything. It's not this, what I hear a lot, just love. What does that mean, right? They were very intentional. They were very prayerful. They were going to their pastor like weekly. They were just so sick of them, but asking for wisdom and counsel, and their friends and their prayer partners. What should we do? How should we? And it was very prayerfully intentional, but it led them to oftentimes just wait. I call it the spiritual gift of waiting. So it was just talking about other things and not addressing that, because that's not the most important. My issue wasn't my same-sex relationships or whether I thought it was sin or whatever. That wasn't the biggest problem. My biggest problem was unbelief. And so they just needed to show Christ. But they weren't shy about talking about, man, this past week, BSF, we were reading through the book of Genesis, and they were just sharing about that to me. And to me, I was like, wow, that actually sounds pretty cool. So it's just showing Christ, living the gospel before preaching the gospel.
Thanks, Dr. Ewan. We've got another question over here.
Being born and raised in Montana, and most of us are from Montana, we've kind of been sheltered. We're big state, big sky state. We have it. Actually, we have it all. And for most of us, there's no reason to go anywhere else because this is home. So we are a little bit sheltered. But there's some terminologies that come up. My wife had a question about transgender. And when she asked me to ask that question for her,
that's a good husband.
Yes, I am 45 years and still working on my half. But I spent almost 35 years in education. And even though I graduated from Bible College, MIB, the Lord led me into education and not the pastorate. And it was a marvelous, marvelous experience working with kids every day. But you already know the kids are inundated today with, who are you? Even at the age of kindergarten, I think we even mentioned that. Even at the age of kindergarten, they're being told, you could be. If you're a boy, you could be a girl. And if you're a girl, you could be a boy. At kindergarten, they're told so we're fighting that fight, even Montana here. So my question is, and it might go with Bob or any of you, but the fact is that there was a referendum that came up, or a opportunity to get something on the ballot here not too long ago in Montana. We didn't get enough signatures to do that, of allowing opposite genders into locker rooms. So if a boy felt that he needed to go into a girl's bathroom or locker room, he could go in there while there were girls in there. It's a touchy subject. As a grandpa, I don't think I would like some man to go into the bathroom when my granddaughter's in there. Amen. I would have to fight that fight. And we all would. So just your thoughts, because that's a big battle in Montana of things like that. Just the world coming to our home. And it's kind of been outside our home, and now it's really here. So just thoughts on how to handle that as a church. I'm kind of preaching, I'm sorry. Bible college does that to you all the time. The fact is that the voters in this last election didn't get out, the evangelical voter, a little bit better, but the election before that, they didn't get out. The church is kind of stagnant when it comes to morality. Where do we make a stand? We're afraid to make a stand. Especially, in Montana even. So my question, it's really not a question. It's hey, throw something out for us, would you? Thank you.
Well, I'll take that one on. And I think that you've put your finger on a very, very critical matter for the church. Is the church only involved in an individualistic gospel, or do we preach also a cosmic gospel? Do you understand what I mean? Because pulpits should be proclaiming the public sins as sins. Now, we may go to jail for it. It happened in Canada. Somebody out in Western Canada ended up in jail because he had preached against homosexuality. I've tried to say, when I've talked to men that are going into the pastorate or who are there, we need to be very careful from the pulpit what we say. This man, I think, got himself in a jam because he said he didn't believe in such and such. I don't think that's really pulpit language. Pulpit language says, God says. And our churches have failed to do that. And I wish I were 25, 30 years younger, and I would try to get on the radio like, what was the pastor's name in Miami, or near Miami? It was on the radio every Sunday night.
D. James Kennedy?
Kennedy.
James
Yeah.
Kennedy.
I don't know if you ever listened to Kennedy, but Kennedy always took his message that he preached, and at the end, he addressed the nation. I don't know of any preacher that does that today. Now, I'm not a great radio listener, so I'm probably not a good person to say that. But the prophets really spoke out against public evil. Public evil. And backed it up with, "Thus saith the Lord." I think we're in an eddy. The church has become individualistic and has forgot it has a social application as well. I'll stop with that.
So about transgenderism, what we see is boys, girls, young men, young women, like I'm choosing to be a woman when I'm a man, etc. What I see it as is that the issue with transgenderism actually really isn't so much about sex, male or female, or gender, male and female. To me, I see it as a battle of truth. What is true? What is real? And how do we determine truth? How do we determine what's real? That's where we're at. So it's actually a worldview, it's a philosophical battle. What philosophy of the world are we holding to? Or are we holding to the philosophy or the knowledge of God? Because the world, so this is actually, transgenderism is just the rotten fruit of postmodernism. We see like transgenderism as like the big issue, which it is. So you say y'all are sheltered, praise the Lord, y'all are. Don't be ashamed of that. Praise God, because there's a lot of mess that, unfortunately, but like you say, it's creeping in. Just like bad sewage and rotten eggs, it's coming in. You can't help it because now the world is really flat. I mean, you're in rural part of Montana, doesn't matter because you have YouTube and television, which, by the way, YouTube I think is so dangerous now. I mean, I don't know how to say this. YouTube is a great, I have YouTube But the way, I don't want to just say like all media is bad. I'm just saying here's one danger of YouTube, is that our kids really don't watch television anymore. They watch YouTube. Well, what difference does it make? Both are kind of television in a sense. The issue is they just watch specific channels, which then only allows them to see one perspective and nothing else. I grew up in the 80s. I was born in 1970, so I grew up kind of 70s, 80s. We actually didn't really own a television. It broke once, and my mom said, that's the devil's box, even though she wasn't Christian, and she said, we're not getting it again. But, you know, my little exposure to television was you just watch just a lot of things. I mean, lots of different perspectives. So, I mean, it was kind of just more broader general. Now, everything's so, you can find your niche. This is my interest. I'm this, and I'm just going to watch that. And then that's all you hear. It's an echo chamber over and over. That's why you get these radical activists that are just so like unreasonable, because all they hear is people who think like that, and they aren't incapable of hearing anything else. How did I get on YouTube? Anyway, my point was transgenderism. But transgenderism is a battle for truth, because it's a rotten fruit of postmodernity, which is there is no truth. There's no absolute truth. So how do we determine truth? We determine truth. We are shocked by that because I don't think we know our culture very well, postmodernity. And of course, in Montana, you might not need to, but unfortunately, I look back in the 70s when I was in grade school, postmodernism was taught then. Totally. I mean, it was you make your own truth. You can be whatever you want to be. That is the most unbiblical ththing I've ever heard. No, I mean, it's like, if I want to be Superman, I'm never going to fly. You know, if I want to be a football player, I'm sorry, I'm 5'7", I'm never going to be a professional football player. But postmodernity is just, so therefore, as we deal with people who are embracing and celebrating transgenderism, this is the one question that I want to hear from those who advocate for transgenderism. Why? Since they say, I just believe in science, right? Don't you hear this all the time? I believe in science. So tell me why, if you believe in science, why is it then that psychology has trumped biology? Psychology, when it comes to transgenderism, is, you know, what I feel, what I think. And it's a social science. But it's a bit more subjective than biology, which is it's not completely, I mean, there is some ambiguity and there's some anomalies. But biology is pretty clear. Doctors don't determine your sex. They look. It's empirical. It's empirical evidence. It's a phenotype. You have sexual organs, and I'm going to record that, male sexual organs. And of course, I'm not talking about intersex. There's that anomaly, but anomalies don't then do away with binaries. But this is the only time that we have two sciences, psychology and biology, that are at conflict with one another. Psychology as well. My mind says that I'm a woman, but my body says I'm man. And the world says, postmodernism, your thoughts are more important than anything else. And that's where we're at. So I think when we realize that, I think where we need to start, not so much about is just the bad fruit, but at the core, which is truth. Ask people, how do we determine truth? How do we determine reality? Because that then gets at the core issue.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Yuan.
Just an aside, we are not sheltered in Montana anymore. With Facebook, Instagram, number of different digital media sites, people are reaching out if they're having these feelings, and they're finding friends in New York City and wherever. And so then they feel empowered and have support. And people are reaching out to find other people in those cities to actually move to Montana. And so practicing as a physician in Montana for the last 16, 17 years, early in my career, you're right, we were sheltered. I didn't see any of these things that I'd seen in Seattle when I was training. But in the last 2 years, I've had an explosion of those patients. And oftentimes it's, I moved up here from Phoenix because so-and-so found me on this certain social media site and moved me up here. So watch out, it's coming.
I have something real quick to add to all that. I think in the end, adults and young people all want to be in the crowd. And right now, this is a very popular thing to believe in. And we see the militancy that can happen if you disagree with it. So I know, for me, being a millennial, that I am seen very often as a traitor because I don't condone homosexuality or transgenderism. You know, one of my family members lives in Chicago, and so they contact me all the time about this stuff. And it's hard to explain it in a way that makes sense to them, because in the end, they really do not care about all the scientific stuff at all. They don't care about biology. It's truth for people nowadays is what you experience and what you feel. And so it's hard coming at it from a standpoint of, first off, God's word, because they don't care about that. So I guess what I'm getting at is, if you know of someone who either believes that or is a part of that circle, do not take things personally, because their fight is against the Lord and not you. And a lot of people, I think, become scared to talk about it because they're afraid of the backlash they're going to receive from their friends. But just understand that you're standing in the gap for them and you're representing the Lord, and we should be bold about that. And I think church is the perfect place to address that. It's talked about everywhere else except the church. I even know, being here, a little bit uncomfortable for me. Honestly, I'm not sure about any of you guys, but this is just not a place you talk about this stuff at all. And it should be the safest place to talk about it. So,
Thanks, Jonathan.
I'm a 25-year veteran homeschooler, only had 4 children, all boys, but my boys love science, and we used some of these videos from a scientist who became a Christian, but he made these videos refuting evolution based on science and showing how what they said could not possibly be true because of what we know now. And I heard, maybe the MD could address this, I heard that once, I have a young friend who's 23, 24, she's becoming male, had a horrible life, and just tried to commit suicide. And I've read that once you start these hormones, once you get past a certain point, there's irreversible damage done. And my question is, must we always come at this based on, I am a Christian, my views are biblical, this is what God says about this? Because the world as a whole rejects the one true God. So must we always include what God says about something, or is it very plausible and maybe a good thing when we are refuting these things to use these facts? And then later on, once we've demonstrated that this really is harmful, this is not good, this is not what you should be doing, but don't include God or the Bible in it right away, is that viable, or do you believe that we should always come at it from the Bible when there is material and there are facts that will quite adequately refute it and show the wrong of it and the inadvisability of it, without talking about that?
I think it's absolutely viable. And I just had a new patient within the last month in that very similar scenario, who is biologically, genetically, chromosomally female, and has sought on these sites people in Chicago that are supporting her to become male. And so she came to see me because she wanted me to help her through this process and prescribe the cross hormones and get her to a gynecologist who could do a hysterectomy and remove her ovaries and whatnot. And she knew that I was a Christian because her parents sent her to me because they were Christians, but I didn't say anything about my Christianity in this first meeting with her. I just purely got in the trenches with her and told her that I care about her, that I've taken a Hippocratic oath to do no harm, and I wanted to make sure to educate her about what she's contemplating medically. And losing her estrogen, although I may not have experience in prescribing cross gender hormones, I have a lot of experience in taking care of women all day long in my practice who lose their estrogen as they're going through menopause, and it's miserable. Lose your estrogen, you don't sleep, you get hot flashes, you get night sweats, you get grumpy because you're not sleeping, and just purely having these hormonal changes leads to depression and suicidality. You just have to talk to a postpartum mom who has had a shift in her hormones after being pregnant and having a ton of estrogen, and then having no estrogen because it's more of a progesterone dominance in the breastfeeding time frame, and women are suicidal all the time. So pointing this out and saying, so first of all, you want to lose your estrogen and have all this sleep deprivation hormone change that's going to make you more depressed than you already are. Because she's depressed because she feels like she's in the wrong body. But she's going to become more depressed, and that goes along with the statistic that I gave in my study or my talk yesterday. People that go through this are 41% suicidality rate compared to 4% in the general population. And when people go beyond the hormone treatments and actually have irreversible procedures like a hysterectomy to remove ovaries that produce the hormone, they're 19 times more likely to commit suicide, because then they find this physical solution that I was seeking for my psycho-emotional problem, it didn't help, it made things worse. And then they don't have the Lord, so they're without hope, and they see death as the only way out, and it breaks our hearts because they need the Lord before they die. So absolutely, I just purely told her all these physical things. As she loses her estrogen, she's going to be at risk for osteoporosis, fractures, end up in a nursing home, end up with a blood clot from being immobile. We are meant to have the hormones that God gives us when we're male or female, and we go messing with that. And so it was interesting because she really listened. And I didn't say anything about the Lord and how he made her in his image and some of those things. And yet I could tell, was like, wow, I may have to rethink this. And I just pray that she will. I don't know if she'll see me back or not, but I told her that I would not, in good conscience, be able to prescribe hormones for her in that way, cross hormones and give her testosterone and whatnot, but that I would be with her in the trenches and help her through depression and walk alongside her through these things that she's struggling with. But that at the end of the day, if she wanted me to participate, I just told her honestly, you're with the wrong doc for that, because I cannot harm you in good conscience.
Thanks, Dr. Wheeler.
Amen. That's good.
I think, yeah, we don't have to bring up the Bible. And for example, now just going through a little bit of the process for a person to go through gender reassignment surgery, or I mean, they've changed it now, so it's now. No, I mean, it used to be sex reassignment. Now it's called gender affirmation surgery. I know. But they do have to go through, I think, about a year of therapy with a psychologist, psychiatrist to then allow the surgery. But, I mean, you have so many very strongly gay-affirming and transgender-affirming therapists who will probably just do it. But they still have to go through that process. But the reality is, even though some might be irreversible, I mean, obviously cutting away sex organs, taking out sex organs, trying to kind of do surgery to make something there that wasn't supposed to be there, that is irreversible and is harmful. There is still hope. And in my last talk on singleness, I talked about Isaiah 56, where God is calling the eunuchs. So my mother mentors and disciples several mothers who have transgender children at different stages. And they're so distraught when their child goes through, a certain surgery. And as horrible and awful as that is, we always tell them, what is most important is the heart. Because I know individuals who've gone through surgery and have come to know the Lord, and they stop taking the hormones, and even though they might have breasts, even though they're biologically male, Some, sometimes they'll maybe have them removed. I mean, it's kind of crazy. They've had them on, removed, or whatever. Or they'll just say no more surgery, and they begin living as the way that God intended. So it's what's more important is that the heart. And what I would do with engaging people also is that no matter what surgery, what hormone is done, you are still biologically, genetically, the way that God intended. All we are doing, and that's a very important thing, all we are doing is masking the hormones that God has given to us and our body is secreting, and taking artificially the cross-sex hormones. That's all we're doing, and all we're doing is just surgery. So we're just masking and things that what God intended. And so those are questions again to ask. And the reality is there is no scientific evidence that suicidality goes down after reassignment surgery. And so you're right. Just naming those facts is important. But like you're talking, I mean, it's so important is that witness that we have to have of the gospel. That in the midst of all that, presenting those facts in a loving way, non-argumentative, but knowing that it's always the heart that is most important, that we want to see the heart change.
I know this is going to be a letdown to everybody, but it's already 3:30, and those were great questions. Thank you for the honest answers. And we have Pastor Ken, Pastor John, Dr. Wheeler, and Dr. Yu on. Could we please just give them a warm welcome of thank you and gratitude?